Hey everybody, welcome back to Theosophy. This is the last in the occult series, and I thought the best finale for such a series would definitely be to talk about sacrifice. In fact, the first episode and the last episode were the only ones when I began that I knew that was going to be the head end and the tail end of the series. So when I refer to sacrifice, I don't necessarily refer to killing something. Sacrifice actually has a very broad connotation. It suggests that you are giving something up in order to get the attention of a deity. And you see this in literally every culture. I don't think there is a single group of human beings on earth who don't engage in some form of sacrifice. And you could argue, from a skeptical perspective, that this originates in the notion of bargaining in the face of grief. Because there's definitely a connection, I think, between the notion that giving things up can alleviate problems associated with loss, stress, conflict, and so forth. Now, the real chicken or egg kind of question is this because the psychology led to the religious beliefs, or is it because that is the actual spiritual reality of the situation and that influenced human behavior? Not here to answer that question, but I'm just positing it because it's a very real question to ask. That being said, when it comes to sacrifice in most cultures, we tend to think of slaughter. We tend to think of what are called blood sacrifices. And history is rife with them. And it's interesting that in modern times we often don't want to be associated with those kinds of rituals, and yet they're the foundations for most rites and rituals in the world. A perfect example would be communion. People are drinking the either literal or hypothetical, depending on which church you're at, blood of a person who was sacrificed to, what's a good word for that? Alleviate humanity of their sins. There's a word for that. I mean, redeem is, I think, in this context, not necessarily the right word because we're talking about the sacrifice itself rather than all the precursors that added up to it. That being said, you see this in most religious structures. You've got blood covenants with deities, which includes circumcision, which maybe someday I'll make a whole video on, assuming I don't get too angry. And there's just so many rites and rituals that involve bloodletting. There's blood brothers. That's one that we often don't think of simply because it does have more secular connotations in the modern era, but it involves the exchanging of bodily fluids in a non-sexual way to become family with someone, which incidentally, consummation, it's weird to think about that as being a sacrifice, but in a respect, you are lessening yourself from a spiritual perspective while simultaneously strengthening yourself from a spiritual perspective with the vital essences of another person. So you're becoming less you and more your spouse, and vice versa, in order to become a family. There's an enormous similarity, or I guess a better term would be parallel, between consummation of a wedding and sacrifice. So, by the way, sorry I keep pausing the video. I know there's like all these flash cuts, but the reason for it is it's the weather's been weird here, and I've got the sniffles, so that's the deal, by the way. But more importantly, though, the one I was really building up to, because every culture has this concept of sacrifice. Cultures in particular tend to value the sacrifice of a living being, or more accurately, an animal blood sacrifice. And a lot of that, what people aren't looking at, it's not the blood itself that's important. It's what it represents. Because if you sacrifice an animal, it can actually be advantageous because you're culling animals that are, there's too many males in the herd kind of attitude. And we see this nowadays all the time with when you eat hamburgers, more often than not it's made with steer meat because you only need one bull in a 30 head of cow field. Really, at this point with modern technology, you can have thousands of female cows and artificially inseminate them from one bull. Not great for biodiversity, and it is currently an issue that I take issue with, but it's possible, it's feasible, it's doable. In many cases, it's more economical. But you're not just getting rid of that animal. You're getting rid of all the potential that animal had. You kill an ox, you kill every potential it had as meat, although people usually do eat sacrifice meat. That's a common misconception. You're getting rid of any prospect for it being preserved, though, long term for meat. You're getting rid of any of the potential for it as, say, an ox to till land. You're getting rid of, more importantly, the potential descendants of that animal. There's a reason why in most cultures animal sacrifice tends to be very young ones, quite often ones that have never been bred before. In fact, that's even where we even in human sacrifice we get the whole virgin sacrifice mindset. It's not that you're sacrificing something that's ritualistically pure. It's that you're sacrificing something and every possible outcome that could have stemmed from it. Benjamin Franklin said something interesting about that in terms of economics, that you slaughter a sow, you don't just slaughter the sow, you slaughter every potential pig and source of income you could derive from said future pig in that very act. Well, it applies to sacrifice. That's what draws the attention of divinity. It's not the bloodletting itself, it's the act of giving up a number of potential outcomes that would benefit a person that draws the attention of said divinity. And that does lead me finally to the biggest component, which is human sacrifice. And I've touched up on this in a previous video where I just talked very briefly about human sacrifice. But the most prolific religion on earth at present is founded on the very principle of the sacrifice of a human being. And the other two absolutely engaged in said sacrifices, even though that's often swept more under the rug. But it's there in our sacred text, plenty of instances of human sacrifice. And European religions are rife with human sacrifices. Survive the Jive has a great video about some of the weirder elements of those sacrifices. Because if you think about it, what has the most potential value in a tribe of people, in a settlement of people, other people? And the notion of giving that up. Now, there's plenty of instances of this being used to dispose of criminals or war prisoners because it wasn't practical in those days to keep them. And that absolutely does drive a point home that in many instances what you're doing is you're giving people that you're better off without to deities, but you're still making it a religious rite in order to assuage or garner the attention and affections of various deities. But in the case of human sacrifice of someone who's not guilty of a crime, who is innocent, quite often, especially with the case of child sacrifices, in that instance, you're really going over a line, doubly so if it's not one of your children and therefore your property from an ancient perspective. You're really taking enormous liberties to garner the attention of the divine. And that effort itself can definitely have some sort of resonance with certain entities. And that's really the culmination of this entire series is just this statement, which is there are absolutely wealthy and influential people in this world, and they absolutely do believe and adhere to left-hand path occultism, and they absolutely do sacrifice human beings. And it's not their children, and it's not any real skin off their back what they do, because they are left-hand pathers, and they do ascribe to a view where actively doing really, really, really cruel things garners the attention of some really, really cruel entities and can result in a more pleasurable lifestyle for them in the form of wealth and success and power and the things that they enjoy. And that's why you see a lot of conspiracies right now circulating around certain pizza parlors and certain people who we all know didn't kill themselves, to the point that it's been deliberately diluted in the form of memes so that we laugh at it instead of take arms over it. But the thing to take home here is that human sacrifice is an inevitable part of the human experience. And some of the people who are the most secular and humanistic and upfront, in the daylight, they're the most far removed from spirituality. They're the ones who are doing things behind closed doors that civilized people haven't seen for 10,000 years. So, like, share, subscribe, keep asking questions. Bye.